You weren't difficult. You were dangerous. Not loud, not rebellious, just unwilling to lie. And in systems built on silence, that's enough to get you targeted. You didn't question everything to cause problems. You questioned because something felt off, and no one else would say it. You felt the shift in energy when the group laughed too hard at something cruel. You paused before clapping. You hesitated before agreeing. You tilted your head just slightly when the conversation turned dishonest. And that hesitation? They noticed it. Because when an entire group survives by pretending, the one person who doesn't pretend becomes the threat. If you've ever been excluded for being too honest, if your clarity made people uncomfortable, defensive, or suddenly distant, if you've been treated like the difficult one just for asking questions that didn't follow the script, this video is for you. It won't be easy, but we're going to expose the mechanics of emotional punishment, not just in families, but in friend groups, workspaces, social circles, anywhere survival depends on compliance. Because this was never about your behavior. It was about your refusal to be controlled. And when control is threatened, systems don't negotiate. They retaliate. Before we go deeper, let's pause here to reflect. When did you first notice that truth made people uncomfortable around you? Who became colder when you stopped agreeing with the group? What part of yourself did you begin to hide, just to stay included? These aren't just moments, they're pressure points. And the more you noticed, the more you felt it. That slow but strategic distancing from people who once called you safe until you stopped being silent. Here's the truth they never admit. Most systems aren't held together by love. They're held together by shared avoidance. So the second you saw through it, the second you hesitated to perform it, you were marked. Not as rebellious, but as non-compliant. And in performance-based systems, non-compliance equals punishment. That's where we go next. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't storm out. You just stopped laughing when the joke wasn't funny. You stopped nodding when the logic didn't make sense. And that was enough. Enough for them to notice. Enough for them to react. Because in fragile systems, clarity looks like rebellion. And rebellion must be punished before others start noticing too. At first, it's subtle. You're left out of the group chat. Your ideas are dismissed faster. You hear your name, then silence when you walk in the room. That's not paranoia. That's backlash. Because when a system depends on mutual delusion, any truth teller becomes a liability. So they pivot. From inclusion to correction. From warmth to silence. From shared space to strategic exclusion. And you wonder, what changed? You did. You stopped performing. You started noticing. And you made the mistake of being visible with that awareness. Here's the psychology. In group systems, whether family, friendships, or organizations, the first one to name dysfunction breaks the spell. And once the spell is broken, control gets fragile. So the system recalibrates. They don't attack you directly. They reassign the story. You're too intense. Too emotional. Too dramatic. Not because it's true, but because if they can label you as unstable, they don't have to question the system that made you speak up in the first place. This is called pathologizing dissent. It's not personal, it's procedural. Have you ever noticed how people become defensive not when you insult them, But when you describe them too accurately, that's the red zone. That's when the mask slips. Not because you attacked them, but because you saw them. And visibility, in systems built on pretense, is violence. You weren't disruptive. You were awake. And they couldn't have that. So they escalated. They tried to discredit you, isolate you, or neutralize you through guilt, shame, or silence. Not to understand you, but to manage you. Because the moment your clarity entered the space, the system was forced to confront itself, and they chose control over accountability. Let's take a moment to reflect. Who started calling you difficult when you finally said what was true? When did the kindness turn cold right after you said something honest? Who stayed silent while you were being discredited because it protected their place in the group? These aren't just memories. They're proof. Proof that your refusal to collapse quietly made you dangerous. And the more you tried to stay in integrity, the more they tried to break it out of you. Not because you were wrong, but because you refused to lie. Here's the deeper tension. The system isn't just reacting to your behavior. It's reacting to its own reflection through you. Your boundaries reflect their invasiveness. Your silence reflects their noise. Your honesty reflects their avoidance. And reflections in these systems are threats. So when you wouldn't distort your truth to fit the room, they tried to shrink the room around you. That wasn't an accident. It was escalation. So what happens next when the system doesn't just punish you externally, but convinces you it's all your fault? That's where the real damage begins. Not outside, but inside. Let's go there next, to the slow collapse of internalized blame. At first, you resisted. You knew something was off. You felt the contradiction before you could name it. But resistance is exhausting. And when your honesty is met with silence long enough, you begin to wonder if the silence is your fault. So you adjust, you shrink, you check your tone before speaking, reread your messages 3 times, calculate how much truth the room can tolerate. Not because you're dishonest, but because you're tired of paying the price for honesty. This is when it turns inward. They don't need to punish you anymore, because now you're doing it yourself. This is called introjection. It's when the group's discomfort becomes your identity, when their refusal to reflect becomes your compulsion to self-correct. You start believing their story. I am the problem. I am too much. I must be the reason they're pulling away. And with every adjustment, every internal silencing, every bite of your tongue, you lose a piece of yourself. Not all at once, but slowly, strategically, until their comfort lives inside you, and your truth feels like betrayal. You type the truth, then you delete it. You open your mouth, then swallow your words. You see the lie, but you nod anyway. That's not peace. That's programming. Here's the clinical reality. When your nervous system learns that truth equals punishment, it begins to associate safety with suppression. You don't just avoid conflict, you avoid yourself. This is survival conditioning, not weakness, not indecision, not drama. But when nobody names it, you call it brokenness. You believe the lie that your pain is the problem, and the system wins because you stop speaking entirely. Have you ever apologized just to stop someone from withdrawing? Not because you were wrong, but because their silence felt like suffocation? That's not apology. That's emotional ransom. And most of us pay it with ourselves. Let's pause here. Answer this. When did you begin to doubt your own perception, despite overwhelming evidence? Who made you feel guilty for noticing what was actually happening? What part of you feels disloyal for telling the truth, even now? This isn't confusion. It's collapse. Not because you broke, but because they convinced you that collapsing was the only way to belong. Here's the psychology they never taught you. Conformity isn't just about behavior. It's about nervous system alignment. You didn't change your mind. You rewired your safety cues until shame felt familiar, until doubt felt loyal, until silence felt holy. And that's how systems protect themselves, by making you protect them from within. You weren't unstable. You were stabilizing a structure that refused to see itself. And the longer you held that weight, the more your spine began to bend under a burden that was never yours. So if you weren't broken, if your collapse was a conditioned response to systemic denial, why did they need to control you in the first place? What threat does independence pose to a group that survives on submission? Let's dissect that next. We'll examine the threat of not needing them. You weren't punished for failing them. You were punished for outgrowing the need for their approval. And in systems built on control, nothing is more dangerous than someone who stops asking for permission. Your clarity? Terrifying. Your distance? Unacceptable. Your independence? Unforgivable. Because once you no longer needed their validation, you became useless to their illusion. In families, friend groups, even professional circles, there's often an unspoken contract. You stay small, we stay close. The moment you step outside that contract, the group must recalibrate. Not because you did something wrong, but because your growth exposes their stagnation. And that kind of mirror can't be tolerated. So they don't say, "You've changed." They say, "You've become selfish. You think you're better than us. You used to be so easy to be around." That's not critique. That's panic. Have you ever been told you were too full of yourself at the exact moment you stopped shrinking? That's not humility culture. That's power maintenance, because needing less makes you less controllable. Here's the psychology. These systems don't revolve around connection. They revolve around control disguised as care. As long as you needed their praise, their inclusion, their emotional crumbs, they felt safe. Because power flows toward those who can withhold what you crave. But the second you stopped craving it, they lost leverage. And that loss of leverage doesn't inspire growth. It inspires retaliation. Because they weren't invested in you. They were invested in your dependency. Think about your own circle. You know people like this. You know who I'm talking about. You show up as your full self, and the room goes quiet. You share a win, and they change the subject. You name your boundary, and they accuse you of being ungrateful. That's not random. That's a power check. Because autonomy doesn't read as freedom to these people, it reads as betrayal. We'll pause here for a moment and let that sit. What version of you was easiest for them to be around? And what did that version suppress? When did you start feeling guilty for needing less? Who treated your growth as abandonment, even when you never stopped caring? These are not personality clashes. They are collisions between autonomy and control, and the system will always choose to preserve control, even if it means losing you. You weren't the villain for evolving. You just became incompatible with the lie they needed to keep telling themselves, that love requires compliance, that closeness depends on collapse, that truth is dangerous unless it's convenient. And you, by existing outside that logic, became a threat to the entire equation. Not because you rejected them, but because you no longer needed to be chosen. And in systems like this, not needing them is the ultimate betrayal. So what happens next, when they lose control, but still need to feel powerful? That's when the return begins. Not to reconnect, to test. Let's talk about that next. You think it's over. You've pulled away. You've re-established reality. You've stopped asking for understanding that never came. And then, a message, a like, a just checking in. A vague thread of connection, sent without context, accountability, or ownership. You pause. You feel the flicker of confusion, the ache of old hope. That's not healing. That's the return test. Here's the psychology. Systems that depended on your compliance don't let go. Not because they miss you, but because your distance fractures their illusion. So they reach. Not to reconnect, to measure. Are you still pliable? Are you still available? Are you still trained to question yourself the second they reappear? Because if so, the contract can be reactivated, even silently. Have you ever received a vague message at the exact moment you started feeling clear? Did it pull you back into doubt? That's not coincidence. That's emotional regulation, from a distance. In trauma systems, this is called intermittent reinforcement, a behavioral tactic that maintains control by offering unpredictable moments of affection or attention, just enough to confuse the nervous system into hope, just enough to trigger the script. Maybe this time they mean it. Maybe this time I'm finally safe. Maybe this time they see me. But they don't see you. They see leverage. And this test, it isn't to rebuild, it's to reclaim. Because if they can still enter your space without owning what they did, they still own a part of you. You stare at the message. Your heart rate races. You feel the blood rush. You start rehearsing your reply. One that's honest, careful, compassionate, until you remember they never earned that clarity. Let's be clinical. The return test isn't about affection. It's about reinstituting the control cycle without overt confrontation. Because if they had to admit what they did, they'd lose the upper hand. So instead, they bait you, subtly, emotionally, softly enough that if you resist, you look like the one holding a grudge. That's the strategy, to make silence look petty and response look mature. But maturity isn't a response, it's discernment. Let's pause here for a moment. Who comes back only when you've gone silent? What does their message lack? And why does that absence make you doubt your progress? Who do you still feel the need to be gracious with, even when they never earned your trust? These are not reconnections. They are resets of the control dynamic. And the second you respond from guilt, the loop begins again. You weren't cold for staying silent. You were precise. Because this isn't about being the bigger person. It's about refusing to be the smaller one again, just to keep them comfortable. You don't owe closure to someone who used your empathy as an entry point. You don't owe a response to a system that never gave you safety. And most of all, you don't owe access to someone who only reaches for you when their illusion starts to crack. So what happens now? You've seen the system. You've survived the collapse. You've refused the return. What's left? Once the illusion is dead and the shame no longer sticks, let's close with that truth. You were never broken, just unmanageable by their standards. You weren't rejected because you were broken. You were rejected because you couldn't be broken in the way they needed. They didn't target you for being weak. They targeted you for being unconvinced. You didn't play along. You didn't laugh when it wasn't funny. You didn't nod when it didn't feel right. You didn't offer loyalty in exchange for self-abandonment. And in systems like that refusal is rebellion. Let's be exact. Your suffering wasn't proof of dysfunction. It was proof of resistance, not dramatic, not unstable, just unwilling to perform. You weren't fooled by the script, so they tried to rewrite your character until you no longer trusted your lines. That's not personal, that's systemic. Because truth that won't comply becomes a threat to those who survive through pretense. You sit with the group, you hear the lie, you see the performance, and while everyone else smiles politely, you lock eyes with the silence behind it. That's your clarity, and that's what made you dangerous. Let this land. You were never too sensitive. You were accurately attuned. You were never too intense. You just refused to dilute yourself for their convenience. You didn't need to win the argument. You needed to stop pretending. And when pretense is the glue, your honesty becomes demolition. Let's pause to reflect. One final time. What part of yourself did you believe was wrong, just because it was unwelcome? Who benefited from your self-doubt, and what does their comfort cost you now? What truth still lives in your chest, waiting for you to say it out loud? Say it now, because here's the closure no one gives you. You were not broken. You were just unwilling to be someone else's lie. This isn't recovery from weakness. This is reclamation from performance. You didn't walk away to hurt them. You walked away to stop hurting yourself. You didn't stop responding out of spite. You stopped because your silence was the first real boundary they couldn't cross. And now, you are no longer cast in the role of emotional sponge, scapegoat, truth diluter. You are the one who saw it early, who questioned the script, who said no with your nervous system before your mouth had the words. That's not brokenness. That's resistance. That's clarity. That's you, outside the illusion. If you were the one who wouldn't lie, who chose truth over approval and silence over re-entering the game, type in the comments below, "I was never broken. I exposed their lies." Your words might be the mirror someone else was never allowed to hold. And if this video gave you the language you've always needed, subscribe to the channel and join our community. This is where systems are decoded, where psychology meets rebellion, and where your clarity is not dangerous, it's sacred. I'll see you there. But more importantly, you'll see you there.